The night was thick with fog as the black SUV rolled to a stop in front of 92 2nd Street. The engine cut off, leaving only the sound of creaking wood and the soft whistle of the wind to disturb the eerie silence. Captain Joe Bulldog Malone stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he surveyed the infamous Lizzie Borden House. The Victorian structure loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eye sockets staring into the souls of those who dared approach. "All right, team, let's get to work," Malone barked, his voice gruff, hardened by years of chasing the unexplainable. His team, the Secret Service Paranormal Investigation Team, SSBIT, piled out of the vehicle, each member tense with anticipation. They were here for one reason: to uncover the truth behind the escalating violence and supernatural occurrences in Fall River, Massachusetts. The house had been the epicenter of it all. Disappearances, mysterious deaths, and now, fresh bloodstains where the Bordens had been brutally murdered over a century ago. Mason Gadget O'Reilly, the team's tech expert, began setting up the equipment: infrared cameras, EVP recorders, and EMF meters. "Place gives me the creeps," he muttered, his hands moving quickly, as if hoping to get out of there faster. "Focus, Gadget," Malone growled. "We're here to do a job." As the team moved into the house, the air seemed to thicken, each breath a struggle against the oppressive atmosphere. Miranda Whisper Gray, the team's psychic medium, froze in the entryway, her face draining of color. "This place is wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Wrong how?" Malone demanded, though he could feel it too, an unsettling energy that made his skin crawl. "There's something malevolent here. It's like the walls are soaked in hate," Whisper replied, her eyes wide with fear. As she spoke, a sudden chill swept through the hallway, and the lights flickered. Tank Thompson, the team's muscle, cocked his head. "Did you hear that?" A soft, rhythmic creaking echoed through the house, growing louder with each step they took. It sounded like someone, or something, was rocking back and forth in an old chair. Whisper's breath hitched as the noise seemed to come from all directions at once, surrounding them. "Basement," Malone ordered, leading the team toward the stairs. As they descended, the temperature dropped further, their breath now visible in the frigid air. The walls were damp, slick with a substance that looked disturbingly like blood. Gadget aimed his flashlight at the floor, where fresh, wet footprints trailed away into the darkness. "No one else is supposed to be here," he said, his voice tight with unease. They followed the footprints, which led them to a small wooden door. Malone forced it open, revealing a tiny, windowless room. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and in the center of the room was a single blood-stained chair. Malone's heart pounded as he noticed the walls, scratched, gouged, and smeared with what looked like claw marks. "Jesus," Tank muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. The team's flashlights flickered and died, leaving them in pitch blackness. Whisper gasped, her voice rising in panic. "It's here." Before Malone could react, the sound of heavy, labored breathing filled the room, coming from all sides. Then came the scratching, long, drawn-out screeches as something dragged its claws across the walls. Gadget fumbled with his gear, desperate to get the lights back on. Just as he managed to power up a dim glow, the beam caught something in the corner. A figure crouched low to the ground, eyes glinting with malevolent intelligence. It moved unnaturally fast, a blur of motion as it lunged at them. Malone barely had time to raise his weapon before the creature was upon them, its claws slicing through the air with a sickening wetness. Gadget screamed as it tore into his arm, blood spraying across the walls. Tank fired blindly into the darkness, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. "Retreat," Malone shouted, but the thing was relentless, its growl vibrating through their bones. Whisper's scream cut through the chaos as the creature grabbed her, yanking her toward the shadows. Malone charged forward, slashing with his knife, feeling the blade connect with something solid. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek and released Whisper, who crumpled to the ground, trembling. Gadget, bleeding heavily, managed to force the door open, and the team scrambled out, barely escaping with their lives. As they stumbled back into the main part of the house, gasping for breath, Malone looked back at the basement door. The bloodstains had spread, crawling up the walls as if alive. The house was hungry, and it wasn't done with them yet. The team regrouped in the parlor, the oppressive air of the house pressing down on them like a physical weight. Gadget was pale, his arm hastily bandaged, blood seeping through the fabric. Whisper sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, her eyes vacant, haunted by what she had just experienced. Tank paced the room, his usually steady hands shaking as he reloaded his gun. "This place, it's not just haunted," Gadget said, his voice trembling. "It's like it's alive, and it wants us dead." "Pull yourself together," Malone snapped, though his own heart was pounding in his chest. "We need to figure out what the hell we're dealing with." He turned to Whisper, who was staring blankly at the floor. "What did you see down there?" She didn't respond at first, lost in her own terror. Finally, she looked up, her eyes hollow. "It's not just one spirit. It's many. And they're angry. They're trapped here, bound by something dark. Something that feeds on their pain and suffering." "Like a demon?" Tank asked, his voice low. Whisper shook her head slowly. "Worse. It's older. More powerful. It's tied to the land, to the blood that's been spilled here. The Bordens, the others who died, they're all part of it." Malone felt a chill run down his spine. He had dealt with hauntings before, but this was different. This was ancient, primal. "We need more information," he said, trying to focus. "Gadget, see if you can pull up anything else on this place. Old records, news articles, anything that might give us a clue." As Gadget worked, Malone's mind raced. They were dealing with something far beyond a simple haunting. If what Whisper said was true, they were facing an entity that had been growing stronger for over a century, feeding off the fear and bloodshed that the Borden house had become infamous for. Minutes later, Gadget looked up from his laptop, his face even paler than before. "Captain, you need to see this." Malone leaned over, scanning the screen. It was an old newspaper article, yellowed with age, detailing a series of grisly murders that had taken place in Fall River before the Borden killings. The victims had all been found in their homes, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The article hinted at something strange, unexplained symbols found at each crime scene, symbols that matched those etched into the basement walls they had just escaped from. "This isn't just a haunted house," Malone muttered. "It's a ritual site." Whisper's eyes widened in horror. The Borden murders, they were part of a larger ritual. A blood sacrifice to keep whatever's here fed, to keep it strong. "Then why hasn't it killed us yet?" Tank asked, his grip tightening on his gun. "It's playing with us," Whisper replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's feeding off our fear, getting stronger with every drop of blood spilled in this house." Suddenly, the room's temperature plummeted, and a low growl resonated through the walls. The team's breath came out in visible puffs as the entity made its presence known once more. The lights flickered violently, casting the room in an eerie strobe effect. Gadget's laptop screen distorted, showing twisted images of faces screaming in agony before the power cut out entirely, plunging them into darkness. From the shadows, a voice whispered, echoing through the house. "Blood for blood, more will die tonight." Panic surged through the group as the voice grew louder, more insistent. Whisper clutched her head, crying out in pain as the entity's influence overwhelmed her senses. Tank aimed his gun at the shadows, but the darkness seemed to swallow the bullets whole, the echo of the gunshots sounding like laughter. Malone grabbed Whisper, trying to snap her out of it. "We need to get out of here now." But the house had other plans. The doors slammed shut, and the windows shattered inward, sending shards of glass flying. Malone felt a sharp pain as a piece of glass embedded itself in his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain as the growling grew louder, more guttural. The walls began to bleed, crimson streaks running down like tears, pooling on the floor. Tank tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped." Gadget scrambled to his feet. The walls groaned as if the house itself were alive, shifting and tightening around the team like a vice. Captain Malone, bleeding from the shard of glass in his shoulder, pulled Whisper to her feet. Her eyes were glazed, her mind still reeling from the psychic assault. Gadget was fumbling with his equipment, trying to get a signal, anything to call for backup. Suddenly, a low rumbling shook the floor, as though something massive and heavy was moving beneath them. The air grew dense with the stench of decay and iron, making it hard to breathe. Tank, muscles straining, threw himself against the door, trying to break it down. But the wood seemed to pulse, absorbing his efforts like a sponge, mocking their attempts to escape. The walls began to bleed again, thick, dark red rivulets running down to the floor, pooling around their boots. Whisper snapped out of her daze, her face twisted in horror. "It's feeding," she gasped. "It's feeding off the blood, off us." As if on cue, a section of the wall in front of them split open with a wet, tearing sound. From the darkness beyond, something slithered out, a grotesque, formless mass of flesh and bone, crawling with maggots. It moved with a sickening speed, dragging itself across the floor, leaving a trail of blood and rot in its wake. Gadget screamed as the creature lunged at him, wrapping around his legs like a boa constrictor. He tried to fight it off, but the thing was too strong, its grip crushing his bones with a sickening crunch. Tank fired his gun at the creature, but the bullets only seemed to anger it, causing it to lash out violently. A tentacle-like appendage shot out, catching Gadget across the chest and ripping through his torso in one brutal motion. "Help him!" Malone shouted, but he knew it was too late. Gadget's eyes rolled back in his head as his body was torn apart, blood splattering across the room like rain. The creature fed hungrily, growing larger, more defined, as it consumed his life force. "We have to move," Malone barked, pulling Whisper and Tank away from the carnage. The house seemed to pulse in response to the bloodshed, the walls throbbing like a living, breathing organism. The floor beneath them began to crack, splitting open to reveal a dark abyss below. Whisper stumbled, her hand brushing against the wall, which suddenly came alive with movement. She screamed as hands, dozens of decayed, skeletal hands, burst from the wall, grabbing at her, pulling her toward the opening chasm. Malone grabbed her by the waist, trying to pull her free, but the hands were relentless, dragging her closer to the edge. Tank joined in, using his sheer strength to yank Whisper from the grip of the dead. The hands released her, but not without leaving deep, bloody scratches across her skin. The floor gave way entirely, and they barely managed to scramble back as the pit widened, swallowing up everything in its path. The creature reared up, its grotesque form now towering above them, its many eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "We need to get to higher ground," Malone shouted over the roar of the collapsing floor. The team scrambled up the stairs, the creature slithering after them, its hunger insatiable. They reached the second floor, barricading themselves in one of the bedrooms. Tank pressed his back against the door, feeling it thud and rattle as the creature pounded against it. "This thing won't stop until we're all dead," he said through gritted teeth, sweat pouring down his face. Malone's mind raced as he scanned the room for anything they could use to fight back. Whisper, still shaking from the encounter, suddenly doubled over in pain, clutching her head. "They're coming," she moaned, her voice filled with terror. "More of them. They're coming from the walls, from the darkness. They won't stop." The door began to crack, the wood splintering under the relentless assault. Malone looked at Tank and Whisper, knowing they were running out of time. The creature's roars grew louder, more furious, as it battered against the weakening door. And then, with a deafening crash, the door exploded inward, and the nightmare poured into the room. The nightmare had only just begun. The door, now reduced to splinters, allowed the creature to surge into the room like a flood of flesh and malice. Malone, Tank, and Whisper were trapped, backs against the far wall, as the creature's mass began to stretch and divide, forming grotesque, crawling figures. Night crawlers, twisted abominations made of shadow and sinew, their bodies rippling with unholy energy. Tank fired his gun, the muzzle flashing in the darkness. The bullets tore through the first few crawlers, but more kept coming, their forms twisting back together, as if the bullets were nothing more than a nuisance. Whisper screamed as one of the crawlers lunged at her, its elongated fingers clawing at her face. Malone swung his knife, slashing through the creature's arm, but the severed limb reattached itself almost instantly. "These things can't be killed," Tank yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "Then we slow them down," Malone shouted back. He grabbed a nearby lamp, smashing it against the wall and plunging the live wires into the creature nearest him. The crawler shrieked as electricity coursed through its body, the current causing it to convulse violently. It wasn't enough to kill it, but it gave them a brief window. "Up the attic," Malone ordered. "It's our only chance." Whisper and Tank bolted for the trapdoor in the ceiling, Malone close behind. The crawlers, momentarily stunned, quickly recovered and swarmed after them. Tank yanked the trapdoor open, shoving Whisper up first. As he started to climb, a crawler grabbed his leg, dragging him back down. Tank kicked furiously, his boot connecting with the crawler's face, crushing its skull with a wet crunch. But more were coming, their eyes glowing with hunger. Malone grabbed Tank by the arms, hauling him up into the attic just as the crawlers surged forward, their clawed hands grasping at empty air. They slammed the trapdoor shut, but the crawlers scratched and pounded against it, the wood beginning to splinter. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the moon through a small, dusty window. Whisper was breathing heavily, her hands trembling as she tried to keep herself together. "We're not going to make it out of here, are we?" "We're not dead yet," Malone replied, though he didn't believe his own words. The crawlers were relentless, their screeches filling the small space. "We need to find another way out." Tank, his face drenched in sweat, glanced around the attic, his eyes landing on an old chest. "Maybe there's something in here we can use." He forced the chest open, revealing a collection of old books, some crumbling to dust at his touch. But one book stood out, bound in leather, with strange symbols burned into the cover. Whisper's eyes widened as she recognized the markings. "It's a grimoire," she whispered, her voice tinged with fear and awe. "An ancient one. It might have something we can use to fight back." Malone didn't hesitate. "Then start reading. Fast." Whisper flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling as she skimmed over the cryptic text. Outside, the crawlers' attacks on the trapdoor intensified, the wood beginning to buckle under the pressure. Whisper found a passage, her eyes widening as she read aloud in a language none of them recognized. The words seemed to hum with power, the air around them growing heavy with a dark energy. The crawlers howled, their bodies writhing as if in pain, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they became more frantic, their attacks more desperate. Whisper's voice grew louder, more confident, as she chanted the ancient incantation. A circle of light began to form around them, pushing back the crawlers, but it was tenuous, flickering like a dying flame. "We need more time," Whisper shouted, her voice strained. Tank, still bleeding from his earlier wounds, grabbed a rusty axe from the corner of the attic and stood at the ready. "You get that spell finished, and I'll hold them off." Malone joined him, brandishing a broken piece of wood like a makeshift spear. The crawlers were relentless, clawing at the edges of the light, trying to break through. One of them managed to slip past the barrier, its face inches from Malone's. He drove the spear into its head, the crawler screeching as it dissolved into a pool of black ooze. Whisper's voice reached a fever pitch, the words flowing from her lips like a river of fire. The light around them flared, blindingly bright, and the crawlers shrieked in agony, their bodies contorting and burning as the spell took hold. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the crawlers exploded into nothingness, leaving only silence in their wake. Whisper collapsed, exhausted, the grimoire falling from her hands. Tank and Malone stood panting, their weapons still at the ready, but the threat was gone. For now, the attic, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant echoes of the house's groaning timbers. Malone, Tank, and Whisper looked at each other, their faces drawn and pale from the terror they had just endured. The grimoire lay on the floor, its pages splayed open as if it were a dead body. Whisper stared at it, her hands still trembling. That spell, it wasn't supposed to be that powerful. "We don't have time to question it," Malone said, his voice strained. "We need to find out how to stop this once and for all." Tank, still clutching the rusty axe, glanced out of the small attic window. "We might not have time at all. Look." Malone followed his gaze and saw the shadows shifting across the yard below, the air thickening with a palpable sense of dread. It was as if the darkness had taken on a life of its own, writhing and pulsating like a living entity. The shadows seemed to form into shapes, vague, indistinct, but undeniably menacing. Before they could react, the window shattered with a loud crash, sending glass shards flying. Something dark and swift darted into the attic, moving too quickly for them to see clearly. Malone turned, and a figure, a hulking, shadowy monstrosity with red eyes and a mouth full of jagged teeth, emerged from the darkness. The Shadow Man, an ancient entity known for its sadistic pleasure in tormenting its victims, loomed over them. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting, and it seemed to absorb light, making it almost impossible to discern its full shape. "Move," Malone yelled, shoving Whisper and Tank toward the far end of the attic. The Shadow Man's laugh echoed through the room, a bone-chilling sound that reverberated through their bones. It was like nails on a chalkboard, a sound that seemed to twist reality itself. Tank swung the axe, aiming for the Shadow Man, but the creature simply absorbed the blow, its form rippling and warping around the impact. Whisper, desperate, grabbed a lantern and threw it at the creature. The oil ignited, but the fire did nothing to stop the Shadow Man. Instead, it seemed to feed off the flames, growing stronger and more aggressive. The Shadow Man lunged at Whisper, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around her. She screamed, her body convulsing as the dark energy seeped into her. Malone tried to pull her free, but the Shadow Man's grip was like iron. The room spun, the walls distorting and closing in as the creature fed on their fear and despair. Tank, his face twisted in rage and horror, grabbed a heavy wooden beam from the attic's framework and swung it at the Shadow Man with all his might. The beam connected, sending the Shadow Man reeling, but it quickly recovered, its form morphing and slithering back toward them. "Get out of here," Malone shouted, trying to keep the Shadow Man at bay. "Find another way." Whisper, gasping for breath, managed to pull herself free from the Shadow Man's grasp. With a final, defiant scream, she grabbed the grimoire and hurled it at the creature. The book seemed to glow with a blinding light, and the Shadow Man screeched in pain as the light seared through its dark form. In a final burst of energy, the Shadow Man dissipated into nothingness, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread. The attic fell silent once more, the only sound the heavy breathing of the team. "That thing was relentless," Tank said, his voice shaky. "We're not safe yet," Malone replied, his eyes scanning the room for any further threats. "We need to get out and regroup." As they made their way back down the stairs, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, but the sense of impending doom still hung heavy in the air. The battle was far from over. The house was eerily quiet as Malone, Tank, and Whisper descended from the attic, but the oppressive atmosphere made every creak of the floorboards seem amplified. The Shadow Man had been a formidable adversary, but it was only a part of the darkness lurking in 92 2nd Street. They moved cautiously through the house, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. Whisper clutched the grimoire tightly, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols on its cover. The book seemed to pulse with a faint, unsettling energy. The team reached the living room, where the earlier chaos had left a scene of devastation. Furniture was overturned, and bloodstains marked the floor where the crawlers had wreaked havoc. Malone scanned the room, his mind racing through the clues they had gathered. "This place is a labyrinth," Whisper said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to find the source of this evil." Tank, still on edge, examined the walls for any signs of hidden passages. "There's got to be something we're missing." Malone nodded, his attention drawn to an old, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was cracked, and its frame was covered in dust and cobwebs. He approached it cautiously, a shiver running down his spine. Mirrors were often conduits for supernatural entities, and this one felt particularly ominous. As he studied the mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a reflection that didn't match reality. In the cracked glass, he saw fleeting images of ghostly figures, their faces twisted in agony. They seemed to be reaching out, as if trying to communicate something. "Whisper, look at this," Malone said, pointing to the mirror. She joined him, her face pale as she saw the reflections. "It's showing the souls trapped here," Whisper said, her voice trembling. "They're trying to warn us." Before they could react, a loud bang echoed through the house, followed by a chilling wail. The sound came from the basement, a place they had avoided until now. Malone, Tank, and Whisper exchanged grim looks, knowing they had no choice but to investigate. They descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The stairs creaked ominously under their weight, and the darkness seemed to press in on them. At the bottom, they found a large, rusted door that led to a room filled with old furniture and relics. In the center of the room was a table covered in grimy, ancient documents. As they approached, the documents seemed to come alive, shifting and moving on their own. Whisper recognized some of the symbols from the grimoire. "This is a ritual space," she said, her voice filled with dread. "They must have performed dark rituals here." As she spoke, the room seemed to come alive with dark energy. Shadows flickered and danced along the walls, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The team's breath turned to mist in the icy air. A sudden, violent tremor shook the room, and the documents on the table burst into flames. The fire spread quickly, consuming the papers and casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. The shadows began to take shape, forming spectral figures that writhed and twisted in the flames. The team was trapped. The spectral figures, twisted and malevolent, reached out with ghostly hands, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. The room was a maelstrom of flame and shadow, the spirits' cries filling the air. Tank grabbed a fire extinguisher and started spraying the flames, but the fire seemed to resist, the shadows growing stronger with each attempt. Whisper frantically flipped through the grimoire, searching for a counterspell. Malone, using a fire axe, hacked at the spectral figures, but they were insubstantial, slipping through the blade as if it were air. The spirits' wails grew louder, more desperate, their forms becoming more defined and aggressive. In a final, desperate move, Whisper recited an incantation from the grimoire, her voice rising above the chaos. A blinding light erupted from the book, pushing back the shadows and extinguishing the fire. The spectral figures dissipated with agonized screams, leaving behind a haunting silence. The room was now a charred ruin, the documents reduced to ash. Whisper collapsed, exhausted and shaken. Tank and Malone stood amidst the wreckage, their faces grim. "We've uncovered something dark and ancient," Malone said, his voice heavy with the weight of their discoveries. "But we still don't know how to stop it." The house seemed to sigh, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly, but the threat was far from over. The darkness that had been awakened was still out there, and they had yet to uncover the full extent of its evil. The basement, now a charred ruin, was eerily quiet after the intense confrontation with the spectral figures. Malone, Tank, and Whisper emerged, their faces smeared with soot and their clothes tattered. The oppressive darkness of the house seemed to follow them as they climbed the stairs, each step echoing ominously. As they reached the main floor, the house seemed to pulse with an unnerving energy, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Whisper clutched the grimoire tightly, her eyes darting around nervously. Tank, his hands still shaking from the earlier battle, scanned the room for any signs of further danger. "Something's not right," Malone said, his voice low and tense. "We've disturbed something here, and I don't think it's finished with us yet." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. The team froze, their breath catching in their throats. They exchanged grim looks and cautiously moved toward the noise. The kitchen was a scene of utter devastation, refrigerator doors hanging open, food scattered across the floor, and bloodstains smeared on the walls. Whisper noticed something on the floor, an old bloodied knife, its blade coated in a dark, sticky substance. "This wasn't here before," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to be careful." Before they could react, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a bone-chilling wind swept through the kitchen. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness. The only illumination came from the flickering light of Tank's flashlight, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. A sinister laugh echoed through the darkness, sending chills down their spines. The sound was both familiar and alien, filled with malice and cruelty. Whisper shone her flashlight toward the source of the noise, but all she could see were shadows moving erratically, forming shapes that seemed almost human. "Get down!" Malone shouted as a shadowy figure lunged at them from the darkness. The figure was barely discernible, a shifting mass of darkness with glowing red eyes. It moved with unnatural speed, its form stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic. Tank swung the flashlight wildly, trying to fend off the attacking shadow, but it slipped through his grasp like smoke. Whisper grabbed a nearby kitchen towel, soaked it in cooking oil, and threw it at the figure. The oil caught fire, but instead of burning the shadow, it seemed to make it stronger, the flames merging with the dark mass. Malone grabbed a salt shaker from the counter and threw it at the shadow. The salt seemed to disrupt the dark entity, causing it to wail in pain and retreat. The house groaned as if in agony, the walls shaking violently. In the midst of the chaos, a sudden blinding light erupted from the kitchen sink, forming a swirling vortex of white energy. The shadowy figure was pulled toward the vortex, its form distorting and tearing apart as it was sucked into the light. The vortex collapsed in on itself, leaving the kitchen in an eerie silence. The team, breathless and covered in soot, stared at the now empty kitchen. "What was that thing?" Tank asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Malone said, his eyes scanning the room. "But whatever it is, it's powerful. We need to figure out how to stop it before it's too late." The house was eerily calm after the chaotic events in the kitchen, but the sense of dread had only intensified. Malone, Tank, and Whisper made their way to the dining room, hoping to regroup and plan their next move. The room was still intact, but the oppressive atmosphere was palpable. Malone laid out their equipment on the dining table: EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and various other ghost hunting tools. Whisper, exhausted but determined, began reviewing the grimoire for any additional information that might help them understand the malevolent forces at play. "Let's focus on the historical aspect of this place," Malone said. "There's got to be something in the house's past that explains why it's so active." As Whisper skimmed through the grimoire, she paused on a page detailing the house's history. "Listen to this," she said, her voice low. "The house was built on the site of an old execution ground. It was said that many of those who were wrongfully executed vowed vengeance from beyond the grave." Tank's eyes widened. That would explain the malevolence. But what do we do about it? Before Whisper could answer, a piercing scream echoed from the second floor. The sound was so blood-curdling it seemed to freeze their blood. Without hesitation, the team rushed up the stairs, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They reached the second floor and found a scene of utter horror. One of the rescue team members, David, was sprawled on the floor, his body contorted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was twisted in a final silent scream. "Oh God, no!" Whisper cried, rushing to David's side. "We need to get him out of here." As they attempted to move David, a guttural growl resonated from the hallway. Shadows coalesced into horrifying forms, skinwalkers, their faces a grotesque mix of animal and human features. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their claws dripped with a dark, viscous substance. Tank grabbed a nearby baseball bat and swung it at the nearest skinwalker, but the creature dodged effortlessly, its movements too swift to follow. Whisper, trying to hold back her panic, recited an incantation from the grimoire. The words seemed to have little effect, the skinwalkers advancing relentlessly. Malone, realizing their predicament, grabbed an aerosol can of holy water from their supplies and began spraying it in a wide arc. The holy water seemed to repel the skinwalkers, creating a temporary barrier. But it wasn't enough to stop them completely. "Get David out of here," Malone shouted. "We'll hold them off." As Whisper and Tank dragged David down the stairs, Malone and the remaining team members fought off the skinwalkers, using every weapon at their disposal. The battle was fierce, with the creatures lunging and slashing with feral intensity. The holy water provided some relief, but it was clear that they were outnumbered and outmatched. The house seemed to come alive with darkness, the walls pulsating and the air thick with malevolent energy. The team fought with desperation, knowing that their chances of survival were slim. As the skinwalkers closed in, a sudden blinding flash of light erupted from the dining room. The house seemed to convulse, and the skinwalkers shrieked in agony. The light formed a protective barrier around the team, pushing back the darkness and forcing the skinwalkers to retreat. Breathless and battered, Malone, Tank, and Whisper regrouped in the dimly lit dining room, their faces marked with exhaustion and fear. The house fell silent once more, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. "We need to get out of here," Malone said, his voice heavy with determination. "But we still don't know what's driving all this." "We'll figure it out," Whisper replied, her voice resolute. "But for now, we need to regroup and find a way to end this nightmare." As they prepared to leave, the house seemed to whisper around them, the echoes of its dark past lingering in the air. The battle was far from over, and the true nature of the evil that haunted 92 2nd Street was still waiting to be revealed. The night deepened, and the house at 92 2nd Street seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that defied understanding. Malone, Tank, and Whisper regrouped in the foyer, their faces pale and grim. The rescue team's loss weighed heavily on them, and they knew they had to act quickly. "Whatever we're dealing with, it's getting stronger," Malone said, his voice tight. "We need to find the source of this evil and put an end to it." Whisper nodded, clutching the grimoire with a mix of fear and determination. The book mentioned an ancient ritual that could banish the spirits. "We need to perform it in the place where the original executions took place, down in the basement." Tank, still shaking from their earlier confrontation, gulped. "That basement's a war zone. We barely survived down there once." "We don't have a choice," Malone said, his eyes hard. "We need to finish what we started." They descended back into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a twisted labyrinth of charred wood and debris. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift, coalescing into dark shapes that flickered at the edge of their vision. As they reached the center of the basement, Whisper set up the ritual circle using salt, candles, and other arcane symbols from the grimoire. The atmosphere grew oppressive, and an unearthly wail echoed through the darkness, making their skin crawl. Tank positioned the infrared cameras and EMF detectors around the ritual circle, his hands trembling. "This place is crawling with something we can't see." Malone stood guard, his eyes darting around as he gripped a shotgun loaded with silver shells. "Stay alert. We're not alone." The basement suddenly erupted with a cacophony of screams and growls. Shadows twisted into horrific shapes, the demonic entities they had fought earlier returning with an even more terrifying intensity. Skinwalkers and shadow figures swarmed around them, their eyes glowing with a ravenous hunger. Whisper began chanting the incantation from the grimoire, her voice trembling but determined. The ritual circle flared with a brilliant light, pushing back the darkness. The creatures shrieked in fury, their forms dissolving into smoky wisps as the light intensified. A massive, clawed figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes burning with an ancient rage. It was the embodiment of the house's vengeful spirit, a monstrous entity that seemed to stretch and warp reality around it. The figure roared, a sound that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the house. Malone fired the shotgun at the entity, the silver pellets sizzling as they struck it. The creature roared in pain, but it didn't retreat. Tank threw a flask of holy water at it, the liquid hissing and steaming as it hit the creature's twisted form. Whisper's chanting grew more urgent, her voice cracking with the strain. The light from the ritual circle grew blinding, creating a barrier that pushed back the entity. The creature screeched and clawed at the barrier, its form flickering and shifting as if it were being torn apart by an invisible force. With a final, deafening roar, the entity was engulfed by the light, its screams echoing through the basement. The light flared once more, and then, with a final burst of energy, it vanished, leaving the basement in an eerie silence. The team, battered and exhausted, collapsed to the floor. The oppressive darkness had lifted, and the air felt lighter, though the stench of death and smoke lingered. "We did it," Whisper said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's over." Malone looked around at the wreckage of the basement, his eyes haunted. "I hope so, but we need to make sure this place is secure before we leave." As they began to clean up, the first light of dawn began to filter through the shattered windows, casting a faint glow over the ruined house. The nightmare of 92 2nd Street seemed to be coming to an end, but the scars of the night's horrors would linger long after they had gone. The sun had risen, casting a pale light over the ruins of the house. Malone, Tank, and Whisper emerged from the basement, their faces marked with exhaustion and relief. The house, though battered and scorched, seemed to have finally quieted. The malevolent energy that had permeated its walls appeared to have dissipated. The team assembled outside, the early morning fog curling around them like a shroud. The sound of distant sirens reminded them of the real world beyond the haunted confines of 92 2nd Street. As they waited for the authorities and rescue teams to arrive, Whisper examined the grimoire one last time. Her fingers traced the ancient symbols and texts, trying to make sense of the events that had transpired. Everything in the book pointed to a ritual, Whisper said, her voice subdued. But I don't understand why it worked so suddenly. Malone nodded, his face etched with fatigue. We've been through hell and back. I'm just glad it's over. Tank, leaning against a crumbling wall, looked out at the horizon. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface of something much darker. The house had its secrets, and I'm not sure we've uncovered them all. Before Malone could respond, a black SUV pulled up to the house. Out stepped a tall, imposing figure in a sharply tailored suit, a government official with a cold, calculating gaze. He introduced himself as Director Clark from a secretive government agency. I've been briefed on your situation, Clark said, his tone clipped. We'll take it from here. Whisper eyed him warily. What do you mean? The house is clear. Clark's gaze hardened. You have no idea what you've stumbled into. This case has far-reaching implications beyond the scope of your investigation. We'll be conducting a thorough examination of the site. Malone took a step forward, his expression defiant. We've done the hard work. We deserve to know what's really going on. Director Clark's eyes narrowed. You've done well, but there are things you're not privy to. For your safety and the safety of others, it's best if you leave now. As Clark and his team began their inspection, Malone, Tank, and Whisper watched from a distance. The sense of finality was bittersweet. They had faced unimaginable horrors, but the true nature of the darkness at 92 2nd Street remained shrouded in secrecy. The three of them exchanged solemn looks, knowing that their lives had been forever changed. The house, now guarded and sealed off by government agents, stood as a grim reminder of the night's horrors. As they drove away, the ruins of 92 2nd Street receded into the mist, its secrets hidden once more. Though the nightmare had ended, the scars remained, both physical and psychological. They had survived, but the echoes of vengeance and the mysteries of the house would haunt them forever.